it's a great privilege to get asked to speak to anybody. If once you know a little bit of my life story, you'll kind of see how I got to that point. But it's a really big deal for me to get to talk to you guys, so much so that I started to have that feeling this morning that maybe I wasn't ready for class or that I hadn't done my homework, or like those dreams, they've continued throughout my life, and you've kind of given me a little bit of a flashback. But one of the things that I wanted to think about this morning and to talk to you about was, like, if I was you, what's the one thing that I would want to take away from listening to me talk? And that's that you can change the world. Like, that's the message. That's the message of my life. And it's really weird how we get to that story, how we get to that point. But that's the one thing that I would like you to walk away from this thinking, is that you can. And that came about by doing something that I love, by having an intention that shifts, and by being successful at it. And it's definitely not the journey that my life started on, and I'm going to go into that, but it's where it wound up. And how that happened is something that I think is a good story to hear, and it involves ultra running. So to back all the way up to the beginning, my story in running and in ultra running, it's a very unlikely journey. I grew up in the Midwest. I had a really, really terrible childhood filled with sexual abuse, alcoholism, drug abuse. I was a terrible kid. Everything wrong that could have happened to me went wrong. I had a crappy family, and I never ran or did anything physical in my life. My cumulative grade point average was like a 2.2 in high school. I was definitely not on the journey to being either a lawyer or an ultra runner at any point in that time. Um, at some point, I went in and out of college. I had, a few stints where I kind of dropped out. Drinking kind of took over. That's a whole nother story. Oh, and I just want to say, if anybody has any question at any point in time, just, ask away, interrupt me, because I'll talk for like 4 hours about myself without giving you any time. So just jump in. I'm used to it. Um, but I went in and out of college, and I didn't really have a way that I wanted to go. And at some point, I found myself working as a cook in a bar with a guy who had been working as a cook in a bar for 25 years, who kept talking about how someday he was going to get his life together. And I kind of looked around. I was like maybe like 23, 24, and I thought, I'm drinking every day. I have a dead end job. This is not how I want my story to end. I have to do something about it. So I decided that I would quit drinking. I got sober when I was 21, so that's 30 years ago, which I guess means my sobriety is older than all of you guys. But I decided to quit drinking and get back into college and to become a lawyer, because being a lawyer sounded like a good thing to do. It sounded like an important job, and everybody told me that I couldn't, based on my journey. So I did it, probably partly because I dreamed of being a lawyer and being successful and being, something that everybody thinks is a big deal, and partly to show everybody that I wasn't a piece of garbage, that I was smart, and that I had something to contribute to life. And all throughout this time, all throughout that journey, this is just background, no running, not one step, other than like when the gym teacher made me. So when I got sober and went back to school, I kind of jumped really deep into studying, got good grades. Things started to happen for me. And it became obvious that I was going to get into law school. I ended up going to law school, graduating from law school, passing the bar. And at that point, everybody around me says, this is a miracle, right? This is a guy who's going nowhere in life. And I got a job as a lawyer in a law firm with a guy that ran marathons. And that's kind of where this kind of strange journey starts, is that there's this guy, he ran marathons. And at one point in my law firm, the owner of the law firm said, let's all run a half marathon together. And he challenged us all to do that. And at that point in time, I said what probably some of you guys said to your teacher, and that's that running's not fun, running's not something that I want to do, and I'm only going to run if somebody's chasing me. That's just not interesting. I was a 2-pack-a-day smoker, just no physical fitness at all. And I took on the challenge basically because I was bullied by this boss. So we trained to run a half marathon. We went to Las Vegas to run the Las Vegas half marathon. And the night before the marathon, my boss decided he didn't want to run it anymore and paid me. It was $100 if I finished the half marathon. He paid me $300 to not do the half marathon and to stay up all night gambling with him and blow the whole thing off. But I had done some running and it had planted the seed and I had bitten the hook. And one of the other guys in my law firm was a 2:45 marathoner. So he's pretty fast, Chicago fast for sure. And I went and I watched him run a marathon and I decided that that was something that I wanted to try to do. And I set out on a journey to do that through, running. I got the Hell Higdon training program. I did my first 5K, 10K, all the way up. Ultimately ran my first marathon in Chicago, and it was like a 5 hour and 57-minute marathon. So we're talking slow. I was a very slow marathon runner. A lot of walking. But I liked it. There was something about it that I liked. I liked the community. I liked running with people. It's kind of like being in a parade a little bit. I got to know other people that ran, which is kind of cool when the guy, across the street says, hey, let's go running tomorrow morning. It gets you out. It gets you running. And I kind of got the marathon bug. And I decided that I was going to break 4 hours in the marathon. So I trained and I tried to get faster and faster. And I never got any faster. I never got any better. I failed miserably every time I tried to set a goal. I've traveled all over the United States. This is the time I'm going to do it. Never, ever did it. And then ultimately in about 2008, I fell in love and got married. And sometimes that causes you to not want to go run and train by yourself anymore. And I just kind of stopped. I just kind of stopped running altogether. And that probably would have been the ending of my story of running, except I got a book. And it's a book called The Long Run by a guy named Mishka Shubale. And most of the people in ultra running wouldn't know about this guy or this book. But the story is he was a kind of washed out rock star that got sober and got off drugs through running and running ultra marathons. And this was kind of like the first time I saw that word anywhere. And what the hell is an ultra marathon? I've been running marathons. And, I learned that there's people that run 50 miles, people that run 100 miles. And I thought, well, maybe that's something that I could do, and maybe that's something that would give me a project or jumpstart me back into the running world. So what I did was I researched all the stuff related to running, are there running groups? Where do people do these races? Learned about all the, the figures of ultra running and joined a local ultra running group. And I remember the first time I ever went running with them, it was, they call it a fat ass run. I don't know if this is a term that you guys have learned in class, but it's an informal run that's not really a race and it's not really a training. It's kind of loosely organized. And so we all we met at like 8 o'clock at night. And the idea was we were going to all run through the night. And I thought, well, that's just crazy. Nobody does that. Running, at night on a trail, running through the night. And I met these people, and these people were the craziest people that I had ever met in my entire life. They were like, the party girl. There's people drinking beer. They brought pizza. And I thought, this is the kind of people that I want to run with and that I want to hang out with. It was, very laid back. Nobody cared about how fast you were, what your time was. I just fell in love with the people and the culture and said, this is for me. This is something that I want to do. And that is what jump-started my career of saying, I want to be an ultra runner. I want to learn about ultra running. And I joined my local running group, ran my first 50 miler, then ran another 50 miler, went and ran my first 100 miler, and then it kind of went out of control from there. I think in terms of my running life, so you guys have talked to Billy Tollefson, Debo, McDougal. So maybe McDougal and me, I could maybe be competitive with him at some distance, maybe, but I think I'm probably the slowest person that you guys have had on your class. To put in perspective, I think that my fastest 100-mile finish was like around 30 hours. I have run a few faster, like I ran like an 8:22 50 miler. So I have run some fast distances in the past, but I was never a really, really fast guy. I was kind of known as a guy that would just go and do it. Like whatever it was, I would go do it. And I think that, in terms of like my place as a runner is more in the winter sports, which I don't know if you guys talked with any of those guys about. You're nodding your head. You've gone over them, but
I forgot that the first week they talked to Kari, they talked to Cuts, and they
okay.
talked to Ryan on this.
Perfect. So yeah, that was kind of like where I found my groove. Was I finished that winter Grand Slam. I did the Tuscobia 160, the Arrowhead, and the Active Epica all in like a 3 week period. And at the time that I had done that, only like 10 or 15 people had ever done it. So that was a really big deal and kind of made me popular within the ultra running world, and especially in Chicago. So now I have this hobby that I'm not particularly good at, but that I enjoy. And what ends up happening is I try to use it to organize people. And one of the great things about ultra running and about the ultra running community is the people. So I founded an ultra running group in Chicago called the Flatlander Ultra Runners in Chicagoland. And basically, this was maybe 2012, 11. And the reasoning behind it was just let's try and find a way to get local people together to ultra run. Because now today, obviously, with social media and the internet, if you want to find other people that do whatever goofy thing you do, it's really easy to find them. But back then, when everybody wasn't like online and organized, part of the problem is how do I find other ultra runners? How do I find other resources? So I came up with this idea. I started this group, which grew to like, I think today it's like 2,500 people that are all interested in ultra running in and around Chicago. I also started an ultra running community online for people that are in recovery, because one of the things that I learned in my journey through the sport is that there's a lot of people that come to ultra running because of things in their past, because of addictions and abuse and running away from things or running to things. And there were an awful lot of people that were sober like me. So I wanted to create a community where we could all get together and we could share our ultra running and our sobriety together. So I formed these two groups, and then we would go on group runs in Chicago, and I would post pictures, but before the run, after the run, here is me and all my friends going running, and there's maybe 30 people standing behind me, and we're going to run 7 hours today. We're going to run 30 miles today, whatever our training run is. And some people started to comment and say, I wish I had friends to run with. I wish I had that, because there's a very big difference, say, between me getting up tomorrow morning and running 30 miles by myself in the woods, or if me and Emily went running for 30 miles in the woods. We would talk about our lives. We would catch up on what's going on. We would connect. Maybe she's having a problem. Maybe I'm having a problem. Maybe I'd find out something about her that I had never known before. But through that process of training and running and spending time together and pushing ourselves and getting to know each other, you create this connection that I realized suddenly there's people that don't have it. There's people in the middle of Idaho or Montana that they don't ever get to run with anyone. And that kind of struck a chord in me, because what I've learned through life is that I'm someone that Malcolm Gladwell would call a connector person. I like to find out that you like fixing cars, and that person over there is really into fixing cars. And I like to bring you both together so that you're a little bit more happy and you can talk about fixing cars together. I don't get anything for it, but that brings me joy, bringing people together. So I was really interested in podcasts and listening to a lot of different podcasts. None of them had anything to do with running initially. One of them was the Adam Carolla show, which when I listened to it way back in that time, I don't even think I've listened to it in 10 years. But he had a news girl named Allison Rosen, and she had a little news segment. And then that girl started her own podcast called Allison Rosen is Your New Best Friend. Trust me, this has something to do with ultra running. I'm going to connect it. So I started listening to this show, Allison Rosen is Your New Best Friend, and it was her and her friends, which are like the lowest level celebrities in all of entertainment. but there's like 5 of them, and they would talk for like 2 hours about their life. And I listened to this podcast, and then my wife listened to the podcast, and then we would listen to it in the car when we were on trips. And every once in a while, my wife would look at me and say, why are we listening to this? Why do we care about these people? Like, what is it about this show that's interesting? And it hit me that I felt like they were my friends. I felt like I was connected to their group. And that gave me an idea. And that's the idea that changed my life. And that's that maybe I could create a podcast that could give you running friends when you don't have anybody else to run with. And so I had this kind of idea brewing in my head, we get like 5 or 6 people. We talk about what we did last week, what's going on with our running lives, things like that. And then one day a friend said, well, you should do it. Let's just do it. So I'm a lawyer. I have no experience in podcasting. I have no experience in entertainment. I don't know anything about any of this stuff at all. And we just kind of made my dream come true. We just sat down in my basement. We hit record. We recorded this discussion. And I thought maybe 10, 20, 30 people maybe from my local running group might listen. What I didn't realize is that thousands of people would listen to this all over the world and that it would spread. And it's not me. It's just the fact that these people want to have these running friends. They want to feel connected to people. And the people, they get drunk. They tell silly stories. Sometimes we're, an hour on what's your favorite, dry cereal growing up, or which nut doesn't belong in the deluxe nut drink, or that story about the time that I pooped myself on a trail or something. It could be anything that we talk about, but we just talk for 2 hours. It's not scripted. And then we put it out into the universe. And what we discovered was people were listening and that we became their friends, and we didn't know that we were their friends. And there's people that now I've realized and now have written in or have talked to me about it and said, you're the only people that I ever ran with in my whole life. You are my only running friends. And I was like, well, this is the craziest thing. This isn't what I wanted to do with my life, but maybe I need to keep doing it. And at some point then I got a review from a listener who said, I don't know how I found your podcast, but I weighed 450 pounds and I was going to start walking, and I looked for something to listen to while I walked. And fast forward, his long story, a year later, I ran my first 50K. I lost 250 pounds, and it's all because of you. And we read this in the room. We all started crying. We looked at each other and we're like, we got to keep doing this. It's affecting people. And in that moment, I realized how impactful and meaningful it is when you do something that changes someone's life or that alters their course in some way. And I don't mean to say that I think me, Scotty Kummer, made this guy lose 250 pounds. I don't take responsibility for that. And I'm not patting myself on the back. But if what I did pushed him on that journey in any way, what I think about is he fits in a plane seat today, like he just sits in the seat and it doesn't spill over. They're like, he might not have a heart attack in the middle of the night. His kids might grow up seeing someone that run. And then I think about how those little things can impact other people and what the trickle down effect of that might be. And it led me to believe that I have to keep doing this podcast. I have to find a way to figure out how to do it, and how to do it better. So that's kind of how the 10 Junk Miles podcast kind of was born. And if at some point I decided, you've met some of these people. I've had Debo on my show. I've had Chris McDougall on my show. I've had Kari on my show, Brian Cutts. These people have amazing stories, like the average person that, will run 100 miles or 350 miles across Alaska. There's something going on with those people. They're not, when you dig into them, you don't just find out they just like to run and it was just something to do. There's usually just so much about them, like what drives these people to do this, that I decided to add another aspect of the show, which is, I call it a long run, where I do a long one-on-one conversation with a notorious or accomplished or famous runner, or just someone that I'm interested in. about their life and their running and anything else that comes up. And a lot of times it's anything else that comes up less than their running, but it's more centered on getting to know the person because I'm very curious as to what makes these people tick and what brings these people to the sport. By way of example, I released a podcast this morning of a man, Ian Madison, who's 80 years old, and he's run 160 ultra marathons. He's run the Western States 100 16 times. He was there in the 80s when the sport started, and he's a linguistics professor at the University of New Mexico. So he's not someone who most ultra runners look up to or think are famous, but he's got a fascinating story. I mean, the side note, The Lord of the Rings, that book, the guy that wrote the book, J.R. Tolkien, was his English professor in college. That's pretty crazy, way back in the day. So I'll interview fast people, I'll interview interesting people, anybody in between, and then I added that to my repertoire. The third podcast that I do, it's called Meet the Nation. And what that is it's just 20 minutes of someone that listens to the podcast talking about who they are, why they listen to the podcast, what their favorite book is, things like that. But it's to get the community to get to know each other. Because what's happened is that now the metric for 10 Junk Miles, we've had about 4.5 million downloads now since 2015. So there's millions of listens and there's tens of thousands of listeners who have all gotten to know each other. And they know the inside jokes and they started their own Facebook group and their own book club and their own record club. And they all go to races together and they have a common bond and they've created a community. And this is outside of me. This isn't something that I do. I don't say, let's do this all together. They're doing it together because they found each other. But I feel like I brought them together, which was kind of the idea behind it in the first place. So I like to bring them on so they can get to know each other on the show. And those are short little interviews. So I do 2 podcasts a week. I've been doing that for a couple of years. I've been podcasting since 2015. And now I would say probably the average show is 5 to 25,000 listeners, somewhere in there. I would say 10 is a normal show, and 10,000 people is a lot of people. I like sometimes I would get down and I would think about like there's other podcasts that have millions of people, and someone said, imagine if 10,000 people came to your house tomorrow. Like that's crazy. It's a lot of people. So then I decided, well, all these people, they like running, and I brought them all together. Maybe I should put on a race for them. So I found this really cool tunnel up in Wisconsin and decided that I would put on ultra marathons so that they would come and they would run. And they did. Lots of people. Probably this year I put on 3 races. One race is a 50-mile, 50K, and half marathon combination. The other race it's the big race we do. It's a 100-mile, 100K, 50-mile, 50K marathon, half marathon. That's maybe 500 or 600 people. And then we also do a really weird race. And I don't know if you guys have talked about last person standing races. Okay. So we do a 12-hour or 24-hour, 48-hour, and last person standing race where you run back and forth to a bar. You run to this bar all night long. And between those 3 races, we probably put on races for maybe 1,000, 1,200 people this year. And what's meaningful about it is that those people, they come and they cross the finish line, and oftentimes they start crying, and they look at me and they tell me, I would have never done this if it wasn't for you. I didn't run before I found 10 Junk Miles. I never thought about running 50 miles before I ran 10 Junk Miles. And that's crazy. It's crazy when someone looks at you and says, what you do makes a difference in my life. So at this point in my life, I look at it from a different perspective than I did. And I don't mean to say that being a lawyer is not a great job and I didn't make a lot of money doing it and I don't enjoy practicing law, but it's not the most important thing that I've ever done. This ultra running, this podcasting, this bringing people together, I feel it's way more meaningful and way more impactful. Another thing that I've learned is that people are inspired through my failure. You look at me and you say, probably not the guy that wins the race. That if I was out there running a 100-mile race, you might say, I don't know if he's going to make it. And a lot of times, and probably as I get older, more often than not, I don't. And I have thousands of followers who watch me go to these races. Next year, I'm going to go to this Leadville 100. And there's a better than 50% chance I'm going to fail miserably with cameras on me and people watching me. And what I learned is that inspires people. And I've gotten the emails from people that have said, I'm afraid to go tackle this big goal. I'm afraid to try to do this race. I'm afraid to put on a podcast or try to host a race or try something new because I'm afraid I'm going to fail, or I'm afraid I'm going to fail in front of people or I'll look stupid. And when I fail or when I look stupid, they look at me and they say, well, look at this guy. He's failing in front of everybody. You know, what am I afraid of? Maybe I should try it. And that is something that I never in a million years would have thought about when I would fail in the beginning, you know? And I don't mean to paint a bad picture of myself. I do finish some races. I have had a great ultra running career. I probably have finished close to 100 ultra marathons. I've done a bunch of really stupid things that, you know, we run, every year we run from Milwaukee to Chicago or Chicago to Milwaukee to raise money for ALS. I had a friend, a running friend, very early in my running career that wanted to find one more 100-mile race before the end of the year, and we couldn't find one. So I said, let's just run to Milwaukee. We'll just run from here to Milwaukee. It's about 100 miles. We'll just run there. We'll get our backpack. We'll get a credit card. It's November. It's like 7 degrees. We have no idea what we're doing. Let's just try to do this thing. And we did it, and it was pretty miraculous. People didn't think we were going to make it. But then he died from ALS about 2 years later. So to remember him, I do this thing every year, and we raise money for ALS. And it's just another thing, you know. And I was thinking about, you know, why ultra running and why is ultra running important? And I don't know that it's necessarily ultra running. You could just put X in place of ultra running for whatever your thing is. If your thing is, you know, frisbee golf, or, you know, whatever it is that you're into, there's a way to take something that you love and help it, use it to help change the world. Use it to bring people together, to inspire people, to connect people, to make people vulnerable, to make people less afraid of failure, to create a sense of community. And that all of those things are great. And here's the funny part about it is that 10 Junk Miles as a podcast is probably more successful and makes more money than the podcasts out there that are trying to be successful and make money. And the reason is money making's not the end. Money making is always the last thing that I worry about in that endeavor, or in race directing too. We put on these races and we sit down and we say, what would be awesome? What would be awesome? Let's get 3 kegs of beer and put them at the finish line. Let's put good beer at the finish line. Let's not give people little tickets so they get 1 beer when they finish. Let's let them drink as much beer as they want. Let's let the people in the community drink. Let's just have an unattended keg and just let everybody party. That would be awesome. And we do that. Now, the business person would say, well, wait a second. You can't just put kegs out in the middle of downtown and let people drink all day. That you're not going to make money that way. But the idea is what would be awesome and what would be fun, and then the money comes later. The idea is bring the people together, connect them, create the community, and the success can come later. But that when your goal is sincere and your goal is to impact people, to make change, to try to change the world, everything falls into place, you know? And I think you could do that with just about anything. I just accidentally did it through ultra running. And I run into people all the time from my childhood, or, you know, people that I grew up with, and they ask me what I'm up to, and I tell them, and they're just like, I don't even remember you being a runner. Like, where did all of this come from? And it's just, you know, being open-minded and taking what the world gives me. And I don't know, it's a very, very strange journey that I've been on, and I have no one to thank but ultra running for it. I feel like that's a good time to stop and see if there's a question or something. I wrote down some of the other topics that you guys have been discussing and my thoughts about them, but does anybody want to talk about anything else from all of that?
I had a question.
Sure.
I was just wondering what your biggest race horror story is.
Biggest race horror story. I think that I did this race. I think Emily might have did this race. The Bear? No. Oh, you did Wasatch. Okay. The Bear 100. I went to do this race and I was a little bit injured. And I went to the race knowing that there's a good chance I'm probably not going to go all the way, but I had two or three friends that were running in it. And we started, and by about mile 20, I decided to pull the plug and go support my friends. And it's kind of a neat thing about ultra running that you can, if you quit, you can go and get in the car and you can, pace your friends, crew your friends, support them, give them aid. So I was just going to take on that role for the rest of the day. And I dropped out of the race. I told the timer, number 8, I'm out. And then I went and I sat down next to this guy. His name's the Rocket, and he's a really old black guy from Chicago, and he's an epic ultra runner that now lives in California. Who's done everything. He's done Badwater. He's one of the old school dudes, and he's just an old sage of the sport. And I sat down next to him, and we started talking about Chicago and how much he loves Chicago. And like halfway through the discussion, he just kind of looked at me. He's, Scotty, you could do this. I know you're not having a good day, but you could, because this next section, it's all downhill. It's really shady. It's a great section to recover. I think you could do it. I think if I were you, I would get back out. He's like, I didn't enjoy it. I threw up out there, but I think you could do it. So I went back to the timer and I told him, number 8, I'm back in the race, and now I'm out again. And I headed out down the trail. And within about 2 miles, am I allowed to swear? I found out the Rocket was full of shit. He was totally lying to me. It was uphill. It was in the sun. I'm climbing up a mountain. I'm miserable. I see the place where he got sick. That part of it was true. But I'm just like, this is the worst thing in the world. I don't know why I even let him talk me into it. I'm quitting at the next aid station, which is like mile 30. So I got to mile 30 and I thought about quitting. And then I changed my mind and I went back out on onto the course. About a mile from the aid station, I stopped on the trail and I said, what are you even doing? You're never going to finish this race. You might as well just quit. So I headed back to the checkpoint to quit. And about halfway back to the checkpoint, I said, well, it's beautiful out here. You're in the mountains. Why are you quitting? Turn around, get back in there. So I turned around. I went the other way. I went back and forth like 3 times. I'm going to quit. I'm going to stay. I'm going to quit. And then it became, now I'm just a guy standing on a trail contemplating quitting, wasting time while the clock is ticking. This is stupid. I'm done. So I went back to the checkpoint, told the little lady with the clipboard, I'm like, number 8, I'm out of the race. I'm done. And I sat down. Well, about 10 minutes later, my friend Amanda came to the checkpoint. She had missed the turn to the checkpoint and gone 7 miles in the wrong direction. So now she's coming 7 miles, but she's crying. And what am I going to do? What am I going to do, Scotty? I'm so far behind. I'm screwed. And I'm just like, you got to get your shit together. You want me to come with you? You want me to go out there? I'll go out. Fine, I'll go out there with you. I'll get you going. So then I went back to the lady with the clipboard and I said, okay, number 8, I'm back in the race. I'm going out again. And I went out with Amanda. And about the time it got dark, Amanda said, I got to let you go, Scotty. You're too slow. So she's going to cut me loose. And I said, Amanda, to set the scene, we're in the Wasatch Mountains. We're in Utah. We're Utah slash, I think it goes to Idaho too. Somewhere in that area, middle of nowhere. There's nothing for miles around. No one's ever going to find you. You're going to die out there. You're just alone. And I said, Amanda, there are 2 checkpoint guys that think that I quit or I'm back in the race. Maybe they're not sure. Here's what you need to do. You need to put your hand on his shoulder and say, number 8 is still out there when you go through that checkpoint, because I don't want to die out here by myself. So she left and I kept walking. I found a girl that was limping and I said to her, hey, I'm screwed, you're screwed. You want to just walk it in together? So we walked together. We got to the checkpoint at mile 40 and then we both mercifully finally quit. And so I'm probably the person that's dropped the most times in the same race of anybody, because I quit 3 times in the Bear 100. That would be my horror story. Anything else?
What's
Yeah,
your
I would.
oh
Oh, sorry, Natalie, you go.
okay. What's your like go-to food?
after you race?
Go-to food after a race is always pizza. And we're in Chicago, so, Chicago style pizza, deep dish pizza. Love it the most. There's somebody else.
I think, Natalie, aren't you from near Chicago?
Yeah, I'm from Naperville, so it's like 30 minutes.
Well then, Natalie, you know exactly probably where I was running on the Illinois Prairie Path on the overnight run from the Warrenville Library. We always met at the Warrenville Library and we ran on the Illinois Prairie Path, which was right by Naperville. So, did you have a question though?
Yeah, pizza. What food?
Oh, okay. I thought there was one. I thought there were two people at once.
Yeah.
I had a question. Sorry. I was wondering how you met your co-host for your talk show, your podcast.
All of those people have been in the beginning. They were people that I ran in my community, and that I might have had a friendship or connection with that might sound good on the audio. And then over the years, what's happened is they've changed. I've gone through maybe 10 different people. Two of them met, fell in love together, and moved to Colorado. We've had all kinds of people that, the job changes and shifts and things like that. It's kind of hard to do when you have we're your running friends, and then all of a sudden, wait a second, where's Amanda? Amanda's gone now. She was always on the show. But over the years, it's changed. A lot of the current staff has come from people that were guests on a show, and people really liked them or thought they were funny. And so we thought, oh, we should ask them back. They might be good personalities. It's very challenging to have a funny podcast with people who are volunteering, because there's a lot of organizing and getting people to come over on a certain day, and there's a lot of stress involved with all of that planning and scheduling. And it's kind of like, I want you here at 5 o'clock on Friday, and you need to be funny, even though I'm not paying you, and this isn't what you do for a living. But for some reason, those shows we call in the 10 Junk Miles queue, they're called gang shows. They're always funny. There's always something. It's never scripted. There's no, we don't write anything in advance. Sometimes we'll have like a few topics we want to talk about, but generally speaking, it's literally just off the cuff, people talking, and sometimes drinking a little too much, and it gets fun. Sometimes it's completely off the rails. We never talk about running. Sometimes I get emails because people made inappropriate jokes, or went in places that they shouldn't have went. But it's been really good and really positive, and I think that more than most comedy-based podcasts, people give us the benefit of the doubt because they know we're do-gooders and we're making fun of ourselves as well as other people. But it's an interesting issue right now, is that it is very challenging to be funny in an unscripted way in a world where there's a lot of people waiting to get mad at you for saying something that offended you. And there's been a lot of shows where I thought, this is it, man. They're going to get me. We made jokes about, overweight breast cancer walkers, or, just whatever the thing may be. And I thought, oh boy. But overwhelmingly, people kind of get what we're trying to do and that we're trying to have fun. So not canceled yet. That would be one of my monikers. I'll talk about these other issues that were just kind of like put up as things that other people have talked about. Social media, that's a great topic. It's an unfortunate part of my life is that I have maybe 10 different Facebook pages. I have 9 Twitter accounts. I have all these Instagram accounts. And I'm just learning now that people can send you messages on all these different systems too. So imagine like all the unread messages that I've never seen on all these different accounts. And you reach a point when there's a certain number of people in your audience where you can't answer every email, you can't answer every message. And that's kind of a hard thing to come to grips with. But I think that also social media can be a mechanism for good. I think that the way that we use it to organize races, the way that we use it to organize group runs, having these informal Facebook groups of runners, it's a lifesaver. And also during the pandemic, for example, even in the ultra running in recovery community, the sober runners, getting together and having Zoom meetings and things like that, that we never had before the pandemic, which is kind of cool. But again, it's also one of those places where there's constantly someone trying to take you down, or to, shit on the project that you just spent a lot of time working on, or the one negative comment that you get that kind of rings with you, over all the positive comments. It's complicated. I did an interview last night of a doctor who's a combination medical doctor and psychiatrist. He's both of those things. And we talked a lot about how ultra running can help with things like depression, mental illness, stuff like that, as well as it can also be harmful in terms of people get addicted to ultra running. People use ultra running as a crutch. So there's kind of like a good news, bad news type thing. I know that for me, as an alcoholic and drug addict, one of the things that really attracted me to running and to ultra running is it was the place where my brain would turn off. It's a place where I stop thinking about the things that I'm stressed out about, or running through your problems and stuff like that. And which is part of the reason why I drank and did drugs. I've also interviewed people that are, they got away from like a battered spouse situation or an abuse situation, things like that. That ultra running can be empowering because, as you guys, some of you guys, I guess, learned, or all of you could learn someday, anybody can run 100 miles. Anybody can run an ultra. Any one of you could run 100 miles next year. It's not very hard. And there's something extremely empowering once you run 100 miles. You look at the world a little bit differently. You say, you know what? I ran 100 miles once. I can do this. And the other part of ultra running, I think, that's therapeutic and that helps is that, and I don't know if any of you have ever had this issue, but sometimes you're presented with something that you want to do, and to get from here to finishing that thing, there's so many steps in between, and there's so many things that you don't know how to do. And running is one of those things. Like, where am I going to get the shoes? Am I going to look stupid? How do I know how fast to run? What if I have to go to the bathroom? What kind of foods can I eat? I have an upset stomach. What if I take my medicine? I don't have the right watch. I don't have the right shirt. There's like a million things that people think about in terms of running. But overcoming all of that and starting to take the steps towards achieving the goal, those are all part of what you look back on when you finish your first marathon or your first 50K or your first 100 miler, is that it's not just I ran today. It's all of the training, all of the work, all of the things that you had to do to build up to that. And that builds self-esteem. There's a saying in the recovery community that, if you want to build self-esteem, build esteemable acts, or do esteemable acts. It's really hard to think of yourself as a failure, or to, have a negative impression of yourself if you just accomplish something like finishing a marathon or finishing a 50K or a 50 miler. They put a medal around your neck. You walk around all day. People congratulate you. You feel like a big shot. You feel like you're someone that did something in life. So that's just, in terms of the mental health and the impact on mental health issues, I think ultra running is a place, and we attract a lot of those people. There's a lot.
I was going to ask, when does that podcast come out? Because maybe they could use it in their paper as evidence.
December 30th.
No, you cannot use it for your papers. Sorry, guys.
Now, as evidence of?
They're writing argumentative papers on the topics that I sent.
Okay.
So 4 of them will be talking, 2 of them taking the side that mental health, that running is good for mental health. 2 are taking the side that it's not such a good thing to undertake or become addicted to.
Sure. I mean, there's 3 podcasts probably in the last 6 months that really speak to that I've done. I interviewed Andrea Koyman, who is a really badass lady. She's done Badwater, she's done Fall Stage, she did Hard Rock this year. I mean, she's super great. She talked about her struggles with depression. Her last name is Kooiman. If anybody needs any links to any of these, just shoot me a message. I'll send them to you. I interviewed a woman named Lydia Rios, who's from Texas, and her story is so sad. She She had a husband that beat her, that sexually abused her kids. She has two teenage nonverbal kids that have autism and are, have all kinds of social issues. She works as a cleaning lady, scrubbing houses to try to, make ends meet and get the money for her stuff. And when I asked her why she runs ultra, she says, because she doesn't want to die. And it was one of the hardest interviews I did because usually we turn a corner at some point, and then I found running, and then things got better, and then her life never got better. Her life is just so sad, and she's actually flying from Texas to here next week to do this stupid turkey trot, which is terrible. I don't know why anyone ever does it, but she's come. That's how sad her life is. She's coming here to do this turkey trot with us. But that's a really good one. And then one other one, her name's Karen Sparks. She was going through a really bad divorce, and her husband burned down her house with her children inside. And she runs to remember her children and to get over that. So if you ever want to feel great.
Yeah. Well, they all seem to be women too. And I know that some of the students are going to be writing about why women are sometimes almost becoming equal with men the longer the distance in the sport. And maybe it's because they have more trauma that they can, I don't know, but it's a really bad segue for the point I'm trying to ask you about is, do you have any opinions on women ultra runners and their parity with men in this sport?
Well, and I just want to say there are plenty of podcasts. If you ask me, I can refer you to other guys that have gotten through hard stuff through ultra running.
So my hypothesis is false.
Well, I mean, so the turkey trot that we do, this 100-mile thing over Thanksgiving, they're making a documentary of it. There's a film crew, and they're filming this. And in the title, I think the working title is Good Grief. And it's about how trauma plays a role in people getting into and staying in ultra running. And we have some soldiers that are suffering from PTSD. I've done some specials about that. And that, I mean, you want to talk about a crazy issue, like something that we don't know much about. And when you start to learn, you're like, this is bonkers. PTSD and soldiers, people that, like I interviewed, one was a nurse or a doctor or a nurse that had to treat the enemy when they came in injured, and it screwed her up. And I mean, there are so many issues that happen with our military, the way that we handle mental health issues with them. A lot of them find ultra running. I also volunteer for an organization called Band of Runners. What we do in that group is we bring Gold Star families and former military people together to learn about ultra running. So everything that I just got done telling you, it's like a tribe, it's like a group, it's like a gang. It's you can find your people there. And one of the things that a lot of people suffer from post serving in the military is they always had their guys, they always had their team, and they don't have a team anymore. And so what we try to do is teach them about ultra running and infuse them into the ultra running community so that they can have that, here in a positive way. That's just a tangent, but there are guys that get through things as well. I just want to say that. In terms of the women in ultra running, it's interesting. I thought about the question, and I don't think that women are better suited for, I don't think there's a characteristic of women that make them better. I think that here's the thing. Men are a little bit more physically talented, just genetically on paper. For example, the Boston Marathon, there's a qualifying time for men, there's a qualifying time for women. Men, it's a little bit harder because we say they're a little bit faster. But I think that when you go from 26 to 50 to 100, that advantage doesn't obtain anymore. I don't think that it matters anymore. And I think that's why at the 100-mile distance, you see more women winning. You see more women, in the top 5, in the top 10, things like that. I've heard people say that there's something about women having children, that they can suffer through pain more, or they're better at, processing pain, or whatever the case may be. I haven't seen any data or science on that. I definitely know a lot of really, really tough women that have done, like one of the other questions is about the toughest, you're talking about toughest races. And the first thing I think about is this, I don't know if you guys talked about the Sri Chimnoy. No? A little bit?
Yeah. Well, Natalie, aren't you writing on it? The self-transcendent 31.
Oh, yeah. The 3100, yeah.
We take the chicken way out of pronouncing it.
Okay. So I interviewed this woman. Her name's Yolanda Holder, and she's probably the only American woman that's ever finished the 3100. And, she is just a remarkable woman with a remarkable story, overcoming a family history of diabetes and things like that. And I think about her 18 out in, well, here's the thing. She's known as the walking diva. She's done over, I think, 1,000 marathons and ultra marathons, something like that. And she's never run a single foot. All she does is walk. She finishes 100-mile races walking. That self-transcendence, she walked the entire time. That's not the crazy thing to me. No headphones. No headphones. Like, she doesn't listen to music. She doesn't listen to podcasts. She's just in her head 18 hours a day, walking around the same stupid block. Like, that's like the worst thing I could ever imagine happening to my life. And she did it for fun. So I always think about her in terms of like tough women or tough races. The other one is the Iditarod, obviously, the 1,000. I mean, the fact that those people go do the 1,000-mile race. I mean, and you talk to people that have done the 350-mile race, like Kari, Ryan's done it, and you imagine like 2.5 times that, I mean, it's like a month being out there on a trail, just waiting for some moose to come and, knock you off I mean, that's bonkers. But I really want to do it someday. I'm not going to lie to you. So to me, those are like the hardest type of races. But I also think like, I have a lot of friends. My friend Camille Heron, you should have her on here. She would be fun. She does like 24-hour race on a track, just on a regular track for a whole day, and does like 170 miles or something like that. I just think that would be so boring. I would lose my mind on that too. The great thing about these mountain races is, you never know what's around the next corner, and then there's this big mountain, and maybe you see like a deer or a bear over there, and it's, you're going through the forest. Now but I mean, to just go in a circle over and over again, that seems crazy to me.
So this was a question brought up to Dylan, and I think it's such a fantastic question, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it. But some of the students are writing about who is the greatest ultra runner, and I feel like this is something that obviously people can talk about for forever, and there's no concrete answer. But the question that was posed was, what makes someone the greatest? So more not who is the greatest, but why would somebody be the greatest? And so in your opinion, what makes someone the greatest runner?
Well, I mean, I think they're wrong about there being a debate about it. I think it's Ann Trason and it's Giannis Kouros. That's it. There's no question about that.
Who's doing Ann Trason? Coy, right? Is Coy doing Ann Trason? No? Somebody had picked Ann Trason. Sorry. Okay.
I got that Killian Jordan
Oh, you've
or
got
whatever.
that. Oh, that Killian guy.
I don't know just his name.
Ann Trason won Western States 14 times. She won the Comrades twice, which is the most competitive ultramarathon in the world. She's got the Leadville course record today, and she's got the 50-mile world record. And before that, she had every single world record. I mean, she was just unstoppable. She's been here. She slept in the guest room. We call it the Ann Trason guest room. I've spent a lot of time with her. She's a very reluctant hero. Like, she's one of those, you would think she'd be, I'm the greatest. She's a very humble person.
Okay, so can I get your opinion? Sorry, guys, I'm going to geek out here for just a second. Previous semester, I had Billy on, and I've had Chris on. And Billy says that Anne hates the portrayal of her in Born to Run.
Yeah.
Chris was like, I don't know what her problem is. I think it's accurate and she loves it. And so, but I've never met her, so I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, she didn't want to talk about herself. She didn't want to do a podcast. When I was crewing her, I like ran an aid station, and then when I finished running my aid station, the checkpoints at the race, I went and I said, okay, now I'm gonna spend the rest of the weekend crewing you. And she's like, you don't want to take care of me all weekend. Let's just go home, And I'm like, you're Ann Trason. You know, I would follow you around with a can of Pringles for a month if I could. You know, like you're the greatest runner ever. And that was definitely her whole personality was just in. And if you listen to my interview with her, she breaks down and cries in the middle of it. Like we got really deep about her walking away from the race, and she met Nelson Mandela, all kinds of stories that like I never knew. But I think that and it's interesting, I just reread Born to Run this year. I read it in 2011 when I first started ultra running. 10 years later, I read it again. And since then, I've met or become friends with every single person in that book. Like I know them pretty well. I know Jen Shelton well and Billy and all those people. You know, Dusty has stayed here, Ann stayed here. All of them are dead on. All of them, except Ann Trayson. Ann Trayson is nothing like what he described at all. Um, the other thing that I thought was really interesting about the book when I revisited it is something that I missed, and that's that Caballo Blanco, his first appearance in that book is as a pacer at Leadville when they're racing against Ann Trayson. And I never caught that the first time I read it.
So I obviously listened to the podcast, and you've brought this up to everybody when you bring up that you're rereading Born to Run. And having just finished it in class, I knew that Caballo Blanco, because one of the students pointed it out to me, that he was the pacer at the beginning. And so every time I listen, I'm like, I know something Scotty doesn't. So
what you knew that? Oh, you knew it before
I recognized that Caballo was at the beginning.
In the first time you read it?
No.
Oh, okay.
The first time I read it, I could barely get through it. I thought it was the dumbest book ever.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's interesting. That's the one book that non-runners or people that have no connection to ultra running, that's the book that they read. You know, I have a judge friend who she's a judge actually out by Naperville in DuPage County, Judge Bonnie Wheaton, whose family is the family that Wheaton is named after. Just a side note. Anyway, whenever I'm in her courtroom, after I get done, she has to stop everything and turn me around and tell everybody that I ran 100 miles, you know, because she was a big fan of Born to Run. So, yeah, I definitely, Ann Trayson, she definitely was, and maybe she's changed over the years. Maybe as she got older, she became humble. But she's definitely kind of the reluctant, and I would say overwhelmingly, I've met most of the famous ultra runners. That's the norm, you know. I think Debo and Billy Yang, they're outspoken. They're not that cookie cutter. When I meet up like Anton, you know, they're very reluctant to talk about themselves and their accomplishments. They feel kind of separated from them. You know, they don't want to be reduced to just what you did. They want to be thought of more as a person, which is kind of, you know, what 10 Check Miles is about, and why I think we're successful is, you know, I don't have Ann Trayson on my podcast and have her talk about her 14 Western States victories, because all of you would fall asleep. It's not that interesting. You know, like how fast were you when you got to this checkpoint and stuff like that. I want to know more about, like, you know, what was her relationship with her husband like, and how did she handle getting old and not being competitive anymore, and, you know, what was it like, you know, winning the comrades and stuff like that. So there's that.
I think we've touched on most of them, but to be fair to everybody else, the only one we haven't talked about, I think, is the barefoot running. Do you have thoughts on the barefoot running? Has anybody ever attempted the Badger barefoot, or do you think they're all crazy?
We haven't had a barefoot Badger finisher. We've had Luna Sandals Badger finishers. I ran a marathon once with Pat Sweeney, who's a Luna Sandals runner, in his Luna Sandals, and a guy named Alex Ramsey, Barefoot Alex, and he ran the marathon actually barefoot. I'm friends with quite a few people that run barefoot or that run in Lunas. I guess my thought on that is that it seems to me that it's absolutely true that running barefoot or with less structure is good training and good for your feet, good for your muscles. I think it's something that you should experiment with and try to do. But I don't buy the fact that that's the way we're supposed to run and that's the way we should run. I run with the most cushion and the most deepest pillows on my feet that I could possibly get. I want to be as soft as humanly possible. So, I mean, I think, I don't know, I didn't see what McDougal said to you, but I think maybe people took that Born to Run message and went like too far, you know, like that only run barefoot all the time versus, you know, maybe it would be good for us to move away from that, to work on our proprioception and to, you know, get more in touch with how we're landing and stuff like that. Things that you don't think about when you run with big shoes on.
That's Dylan's take on it. And then Chris's, it's morphed every time I've talked to him. He's kind of walked a little bit further back from it. And this last time he basically said that when done properly, barefoot running is preferable to running with cushion shoes, but most people don't take the time to learn how to run barefoot or to get trained up, basically. So he's qualified it a little bit, but
I mean,
first time I talked to him, he was like, nope, you're stupid if you run in shoes. Like, that's
I ran
it.
in frost and ice this morning, you know? I mean, that seems bonkers to me. It seems
Yeah.
bonkers.
You know, that might be the toughest race though, if you did ITI barefoot.
For sure.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we're pretty much out of time, but I have to say thank you so much because I haven't seen these guys like lean forward with any of our guests. So you clearly impressed them and you've of course impressed me. So thank you very much for your time and everything that you've offered them today.
And don't forget, only thing I need you to remember from the whole thing, you can change the world, all of you.
Great.
Don't forget.
Don't forget. Great.
All right?
Thank you so much, Scott.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, guys.
Thank you.